I'll start with a quick question. Does anyone know what that is? Does anyone know where that is? This is in Milo, in Haiti. And it's a castle built in the jungle in 1810. It has artificial fountains. It has ballrooms, royal chapels. At its peak, it sported a court of more than 500 people, artists, cooks, tutors, grooms. It has Italian marble, European chandeliers, and it was built for a black king. This is Henri I. He was a bricklayer initially and a cook's apprentice, and he won a war against Napoleon's forces in Haiti, effectively building the first black monarchy after a European colonial power. They introduced a Haiti noble code with 47 articles. It's an absolutely unimaginable story that took place in Haiti in the early 19th century. And there's many, many things that I find very inspiring about this story. One of the things that is, I think, extremely interesting, maybe also for today, I hope, Haitian historian Michel Rolfe-Trouillot pointed that out, which is, this is something, an event in history that took place that is genuinely unthinkable. It was unthinkable before it happened. It was a future that no one could fathom. It was unthinkable while it happened. The revolutionary couldn't think it. The colonizers had no idea of thinking it. There's actually letters of them sending home reports to France just a week before everything came apart. Everything is fine here, you should come over and visit. Even after it took place, no one could think it. It took over 100 years for black activists and writers like Frederick Douglass and W.E. Du Bois to actually look back at Haiti and tell the story what it actually was. It's a future that kind of took place without anyone being able to think it. And that's a little bit of my, I would say, my question or maybe my provocation for today, which is, I think the most radical futures are genuinely unthinkable. We cannot think them. And I explain a little bit more what I think, why that is, and also what we could do about that. So I'm Simon. I work with an organization called Dark Matter Labs. We design transition for economic, political, financial, social systems towards something that we, and hopefully all of us, think are more just futures and more just systems. And I do so specifically by working with public institutions, but I'll get to that in a minute. Now, from Haiti to today, I'll skip and cut short the part of telling once again how we're living in a poly crisis, in a meta crisis, so many versions of telling how we live in something that effectively is a planet that is kind of on self-destruct mode. Democratic erosions, economic collapse, authoritarian regimes getting power. Many of the systems that basically sustain us are coming apart. So more recently, I think, actually, US military has called this the age of consequences, which I like, because it's not something that is going to happen. These are consequences of decisions, of systems, of futures that generations before us decided to kind of implement and to build. And now we live with that. And I would like to discuss a slightly unsettling, slightly provocative question, which is, what if we can't imagine our way out of this? What if the way out of this, just like Haiti thinking into some kind of black king future, What if the way out of is something that we cannot compute, we cannot fathom, we cannot think, no matter how many explorative sessions, imaginative sessions, science fiction, social fiction, novels and writings we write, we always write them from where we are, and maybe the real radical future that we need is something just beyond the frame of reference that we have. What would that do to us, to our future's work? How can we work with these frames and unframe the futures that we have to work in? Now, it's a tricky question, I know. To answer it, let's just take a little bit of a stock. When I said earlier, there's frames. What I mean with this is I think as soon as we talk about the future, there's something like a binary always creeping in, like a from and a to. Many of you probably know a version of this, which is basically saying, this is where we are, this is where we're going, this is where we want to go, this is where we do not want to go. Many versions of this, from future cones to desirable futures to sustainable futures and so on. What I like about this particular illustration is not just that it maps different pathways, it's also that it shows how resilient some of these pathways are, and there are moments of low resilience where you can kind of branch off, and then there are moments of high resilience where it's very hard to change the pathways. But the principle still stands. It's a logic of binaries, thinking of the past and the present, desirable, not desirable, good and bad, which in itself isn't a bad thing. I think binaries, maybe, they get a lot of heat, but I think they are also something that we need to make sense of the world. We need binaries, we need differences to kind of orient ourselves. And a great case in point, I think, is this, maybe some of you know, this field guide for more than human politics. It's been a few years that it's been around by Superflux. And I think it's really nice to think about these binaries in a from human to more than human, from fixing to planning, to caring, from growth to nurture. So I think it really helps orient ourselves. But what these binaries do, if you think from and to, desirable, non-desirable, is they put a frame about the type of thinking that we have. And something kind of gets lost along the way. Something is always out of that frame. Or you can even say in between the binary. So when we talk about unthinkable futures, I would be curious to see what is outside of that frame. And a beautiful way of saying this, or of looking at this, is a figure called the Parasite. It's a beautiful book by Michel Serres called The Parasite, strong recommendation. Tells a story, or kind of retells a story. Maybe some of you know this, an old kind of, I think, kids fairy tale. A rat from the countryside goes to visit their pal living in the city rat, for a feast, because the city rat lives in the house of a tax collector. And it really plays a lot with who's the parasite here? Who's feeding off of whom? Is the country rat feeding off the city rat? Both of them feeding off the tax collector? Lots of things to unpack there. But what's interesting is the whole story ends with a noise somewhere in the kitchen, and then the rats go away, and that's how everything shifts. And I wonder, what is that noise in our world? And what are the parasites in the futures, in the frames that are sitting outside of the things that we can see and sitting outside of the things that we can think? Because maybe we need them to move ahead. So how do you spot a parasite, or to put it differently, a glitch? A glitch is something in a system that is, it's there, you tend to ignore it. It's also a little bit annoying. You don't put too much of attention to it. But those glitches, or those parasites, or this kind of glitched futures are something that I find very interesting to at least try to move beyond this kind of frame that I was mentioning earlier. And I was wondering, how do these glitches look like today? This is a kite festival in Gaza. It actually took place last year. I think it takes place every year. I think it many times made it to the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest kite festival in the world. Tens and tens of thousands of kites being flown by children. Children being obviously the groups most severely affected by this ongoing campaign of destruction, over 1 million children being affected, killed, injured, traumatized by estimates of UNICEF. And I find it so interesting because, to be honest, it doesn't make sense. You literally live through hell and you have a kite festival? Like, I find it interesting because it kind of sits out of the binary of maybe death and life, hope and despair. It's somewhere there and it doesn't quite compute to, what does that mean? Like, what did we do with it? Like, I think we look at it and then we go like, yeah, it's cute, we shrug. Okay. This is another example just from a few months ago. What I found interesting about the wildfires in the Palisades is that it was absolutely clear once this is done, we're going to rebuild. People would just go back and rebuild. In an area that is so prone to wildfires, it's literally a matter of time for the whole thing to repeat itself. Actually, as a matter of fact, insurers are encouraging people to rebuild rather than to retreat. We're geared in a way that is kind of stuck in a loop that is, again, it's weird. What is this? Is this just playing with chance and risks? Is it rational? Is it post-rational? How do we make sense of this? And I think to an extent, it just evades making sense of this. Another example is from Kenya. This is Kibera, a large district in Nairobi, Kenya. Houses somewhere in between 200,000 and 1 million people. Kibera translates to forest, which I find interesting, forest or jungle, in Kinubi, the local language. And it's an off-the-grid territory. We all know these kind of informal settlements. It's informal, it's unmapped, it's unplanned. And what's interesting is that most of the people that moved there, for them, there was a temporal step. There was like, we're going there as a kind of step in between to move towards the city. It's kind of a transient space. But it's not transient anymore. This is a multi-generational city that is completely working on its own. People are born there, people die there. It's sitting outside of before and after. It's sitting outside of this frame of permanence and temporality. It's a glitch. It shouldn't be there, it's still there. What do we do with it other than say, yeah, I guess? So there are many of these glitches, and I think not all of those are like beautiful stories of meaning. Sometimes they're just glitches, maybe? I don't know. That's the point of glitches. You don't know what it means. To speak in future terms, they're somewhere in between signal and noise, I feel. They're a nuisance. It can go either way. And to channel David Bowie here, if you can think it, it's too late. If you want to think about the parasite, it's not a glitch anymore. It's a sign, it's a signal. You put some meaning to it, you tell a story about it, which is fine, but you left the space of the parasite. The parasite now is part of the frame. So, okay, that was a lot of abstract theory. But if you take that to heart and really think like maybe those futures that we need to build, we cannot think them yet, but we need to do something, obviously. What do you do with it? How do you design for a future that we cannot think? And now I'd like to bring a few examples maybe for this from our work at Dark Matter and beyond. And I'd like to share like 5, I would say, entry points or starting points. It's definitely not steps of a process. It's definitely not principles. It's just maybe lenses to look at this. The first lens is how do you sense something that's invisible? And to really bring it down from the metaphorical language to just how does it look like in practice? One of the, I think, very inspiring initiatives that are taking place, I cannot take any credit of this happened way before my time at Dark Matter, is a project called Trees AI, Trees as Infrastructure, which basically does a very simple thing. Currently, trees in a city are cost factors. Basically, you plant them, you maintain them, probably have to insure them. At one point, they become a risk, you cut them down. Which is because a public institution like a city doesn't see a lot of the things that are going on with a tree, a lot of the benefits that a tree is actually generating. Health benefits, soil, health. It's actually a countermeasure to heat islands, quality of noise, noise reduction. So what Trees AI does is basically working with cities to put those other aspects back on the map. to make something visible, legible really, for the systems that we work with that currently goes unnoticed, is currently outside of that frame of reference. And in the same spirit, I think, another project that I find very inspiring, again, no credit to be taken from me, again, colleagues, it's called the Cornerstone Indicators, which is playing with the same idea of like what is legible for our systems and specifically our institutions. The Cornerstone Indicators goes back to, I think, a beautiful idea by economist Catherine Trebeck, which asks, okay, we have a lot of KPIs in our cities, economic growth, and so on and so forth, basically the things that we can measure. What if we measured the number of 8-year-old girls that go to school by bike every morning? What does that tell us about quality of life, education, equality, safety in our neighborhoods? Wouldn't that be a number that would be interesting? And like riffing off of this, the Cornerstone Indicators basically is a whole library of indicators that ask, like, what if we measured people that are happy not owning a car? Spaces in the city that are regularly used by multiple generations. Number of people that are happy on a Sunday night looking towards the week ahead. So the point here is we need to rebuild a sensing layer that allows to make legible the many invisible kind of things that sit outside the frames that we currently work with. There's countless of other examples. I'm keeping it short here, but that would be like a first starting point. If we want to think about the unthinkable, what do we have to see that we currently can't see? The second starting point or entry point would be, how do we imagine this? Again, preaching to the choir, literally here, I think. So I'll keep short the long list of amazing, alternative, inspiring futures that are out there, from Afrofuturism to very political futures. This is a photo from a place called Chimurenga in the city of Cape Town, which is one of the most vibrant cultural places that just literally imagines a different version of the city in the city through arts and culture. Muslim Futures and Queer Futures is an amazing initiative by the Super Lab in Berlin. Even small places like the Kiosk Radio in Brussels, which basically just repurposed an old, I think, toilet house to make it a public local space, but also, since there were a lot of like globally successful DJs, it became a global hub, a hub for a global network of musicians to like now meet there. To even building the infrastructure, the Prototype Fund is the project that I've been working with in the past. It's basically providing funds to open source public interest tech without planning what that tech is. It's providing an infrastructure for imagining new things and futures. Or you could also say it's hosting benevolent parasites. You know there's something out there that you can plan that. So what can you do for those parasites to be sitting somewhere in your frames without you necessarily being able to think about them or plan for them? Now it gets a bit more tricky. How do you coordinate and how do you govern that? Like in addition to like collecting data and maybe opening up frames of references and imaginaries, how do you then make that work in a way that really kind of moves us forward? I said it gets tricky. So this is where I spend almost all of my time at DAC. It's a project called Net Zero Cities. It's one of the huge missions by the European Commission with the slightly outrageous goal to transform 100 European cities to net zero climate emissions by 2030. Yeah. Exactly. And many challenges attached to this. One of the patterns of challenges that I find quite interesting is obviously, and I think we've heard this across the past 2 days, is those binary thinking again. It's economic growth, whether it's climate change or climate resilience. It's, in many cases, my personal interest of profit against the collective interest of maybe transitions and so on. Lots of these binaries. And I think the idea when it comes to governing this kind of transitions is really, what can we do with those binaries to not do away with them because they are there. This is how systems and people tick. But how can we kind of reframe them in a way they open up an option space? Somewhere in between the binaries, finding positions in the place or in the field in between those binaries. And this is something that we do in our work. This is actually a draft prototype for a workshop that we've been running with the city to say, how can we move from here to there, and what are core actors in our urban ecosystem to move them up here? And also, how can we help these actors to coordinate among themselves, actually share the data, understand what are you doing, what am I doing, how can we move together in a way that is not planned by one master planner, but it is kind of self-governed. To that end, this is a kind of a dashboard developed by two cities, Eindhoven and Helmond, that basically built a decentralized database for all actors in the city to map and share what they're doing regarding the mission and understand what else is going on so they can self-coordinate. There's another example, probably some of you know, Freetown, Treetown. Probably a full talk just on that project wouldn't do it justice. Just one tiny glimpse of this. The idea here is in Freetown to incentivize citizens to plant trees and to maintain the trees. This is going to be monitored digitally, being fed into each tree has a token, an environmental token, which then basically captures the environmental value, similar to the tree's AI of the tree, which is then marketed on the carbon market to companies being interested in offsetting climate emissions. And that money is being funneled back to the city, to the citizens. So specifically, if you're maintaining a tree, that token gets traded and you get a long-lasting loop, economic growth, cohesion, social cohesion, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the patterns here is something that we call, it's autonomous and aligned. It's coordinating action for autonomous actors in a way that is aligned towards a bigger shared mission. And obviously, there's not just one mission. Not everyone wakes up in the morning and thinks about net zero climate emissions. Everyone has their little kind of priorities, binaries or frames. So the alignment part really comes in. So how do you translate in between these different logics? Being slightly conscious of time, moving on. Two more kind of entry points that I wanted to briefly mention. So if we think about what do we sense, what do we imagine, how do we coordinate this, what do we do about implementing? I said earlier that with these many, many crises that we're facing, probably what got us here won't get us out of here. The type of thinking that ran our institutions to where they are today probably isn't the type of thinking that we need to get out of it. Probably not strong disagreement. But what is that type of thinking? Again, hopefully not all too controversial, but many of you probably know the double diamond, spending a lot of time of understanding the problem, spending a lot of time of understanding the solution. The double diamond, it's a diamond because it's diverging, and then it's closing down. The core idea of the double diamond, and many other processes, is to filter out complexity in order to get some focus point. Again, opening it up, filtering it out. So a danger that is in this kind of opening and closing processes is that you end up with an idea of a silver bullet, a magical solution. Well, we did a lot of workshops. We invited all the people. Here is what's really tried and tested. That'll save it. So I think we need to move on beyond this kind of silver bullet thinking. I'm not the only one to say this. Cora, UNDP, many others have come definitely before me. So what's currently emerging, which I find interesting, is, okay, if you move beyond the silver bullet thinking, you move into something that's basically a portfolio, something that we know from finance, right? You hedge your bets. You don't put all your bets in one basket. You don't have one silver bullet. You have 10, 50, 100. And the idea is you mitigate risk by just placing diverse bets. And if one doesn't go, it's fine because you have 10 others. Now, this is, I think, a step in the right direction. I think what we're looking at is something like, how can we move that even further and think about if we have this bets of 10, 50, 100 measures, one of the core elements of net zero cities is something called an action plan. It's up to 200 measures that a city came up with on how to mitigate climate change. What if we also want to understand how these measures affect one another? Measure number 1, 2, and 5. How do they kind of, if I do this, is it easier to then do that? And how does it inform the third thing? What about synergies and trade-offs and shared kind of interdependencies? And it gets messy incredibly quickly. It doesn't get messy, it just gets so complex, 250 by the power of 250, There is no single planning department in the world that can even fathom that kind of complexity. So if we really treat portfolios as something that we want to work with, we have to unlock and really leverage the, sorry for the big words, the computational capacity that is in the ecosystem rather than us trying to compute for it. We have to leverage the entire system to self-govern rather than have a master plan. So this kind of systemic or second generation portfolios are basically looking like a network. It's not multiples, it's multiplicities. How does it look in practice? This is an example from the city of Umeå in Sweden, mapping their portfolio with a focus on the interrelations and the connections, trying to understand what are leverage points, what are synergies that we can actually leverage, what are trade-offs that we have to be aware of. It's far from done. Way more needs to be added there, specifically actors, specifically resources that are required, but it's a step towards trying to understand how does the system kind of self-organize and what can we do to help with this self-organization. So the focus shifts from making a plan to looking at something that we'll call enabling conditions, right? What are the enabling conditions for the system to respond to it? A very simple example is from the city of Trondheim and their walking strategy. Really love that idea. How can we incentivize more people to walk instead of go by car? Well, we changed the enabling conditions. We changed the context, and like a tiny little intervention there was just putting a lot of benches in the city. Lots of benches had a kind of a trickle-down effect for people, how they responded to it. Obviously, many people would then actually take a walk that usually they wouldn't do. They would sit down, have the chance for a break. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So this is not the silver bullet. The point here is you change the conditions, see what happens, and then the system responds and becomes part of the solution. So creating enabling conditions, and by the way, disabling conditions. Whenever you enable something, you disable something else. There's a balance in the system. This is something that we try to work with. And then finally, and then I'm through with those 5 potential entry points, is learning. How do you learn something that you don't even know, coming back to those glitches that you don't even see, that you can't even think? Again, to answer this, I think it helps to quickly clarify what do we mean by learning really. Because what we need to learn here is we need to learn how to learn on a systems level. We need to build a systemic capacity, not just for our cities, I would even say for our society, to learn differently. So if we take a closer look at learning, in this sense, it becomes very close to a notion of evolution. And a beautiful, really beautiful framing of what evolution is this one. It's basically 3 elements of this. The first one is variation. So you need the new. You need the irritation. You need something that hasn't been there before. If you only do this, obviously there's a problem. I get to this. But you need, in order to learn, in order to understand how we can move on towards some kind of a future, you need something that hasn't been there before. And on the other side of the equation, you need retention. Retention is stability. Retention is retaining what has been worked before, has been working earlier, and you retain in it to kind of stabilize the system, the institution, the city, the organization that you're working with. Now, both of these sides, if you're too far on one end, is problematic. If you go too far to variation, the system becomes unstable, it falls apart. Everything is possible, everything is new, everything is irritating. That's the end. If you move too far towards retention, that's also literally deadly. This is something called, with a very weird name, an ant mill. Maybe some of you know this. Army ants sometimes end up with a circle if they lose the pheromone trail. To basically end up in this loop, and this literally goes on until they die of exhaustion. The interesting thing about this is everything is according to plan. Every part of that system is doing what it's supposed to do. Everyone is following what, like the predecessor, whatever one, the aunt before them. But the system collectively collapses. It's a systemic failure of the system. So the question really is, what are the loops that we are caught ourselves in? Where do we see things where everything is absolutely according to plan? You cannot point out a single kind of point of failure, but the systemic pattern is set up in a way that the system basically dies. So that's bleak. Somewhere in between, you need a mediation function, and you need a selection function. And I think this is really where learning happens. This selection function, I think, translated to society, is just culture. What is the new that we consider relevant? What is the old that we consider safe, that we consider valuable to save? And how do we make that selection in our democratic institutions, in our cities, in our lives, in our organizations? When do we know when to select the new? When do we know when to retain the old? When to rediscover the old? So that's another kind of layer that I wanted to highlight. Again, lots of historical precedents of people trying to do this. The Justice and Truth, TRC, Justice and Reconciliation Commission in Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa tries to do this by doing something, connecting the binaries of justice and truth. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the story. The idea was that perpetrators would actually admit to all the violence and kind of terror they've been doing, but would receive amnesty for this in order to chart a pathway for healing, transcending the binary of either or, it's true or it's just. And it was a deliberate attempt to learn a new way to deal with old generational systemic conflicts of violence. How can we learn the new, get the variation, and retain it? And there are many other ways to do the new. And I'm basically done, just 2 or 3 highlights here. One way to learn about the new is conversation. Europe Talks, Germany Talks is a tiny little, it's like on the other end of the spectrum, but a beautiful project to match people from literally different sides of the aisle, societal, political opponents, put them in a conversation, that's it. You can apply answering controversial questions of your time. You get matched with someone who answered that question exactly from the opposite end. You talk, that's it. Bringing variation to the mix. Whatever happens, we'll see. It's an enabling condition, opening up potentials. It's not planning a future. It's not imagining. It's just saying, what if? And you bring a new resource and infrastructure for a new way of self-governance. You can also bring the new into the old. Public Practice is a beautiful organization in the UK that brings in designers into public institutions. Again, bringing in variation into a system that kind of retains it, and just by bringing them in, planting them in the planning department, but not someone who's been working in the city for 20 years, having them, but also someone who's a visual designer, an architect, working together. And then there's also the collective, just like insight and realization, hey, we're stuck. We need to get unstuck together. This is an initiative by the UNDP, actually the Strategic Innovation Unit, I think, is involved in this, which is kind of what types of variation and what kinds of retention patterns do we see and how can we move beyond. The core of all of this is that you start asking questions. You design doubts in a way. How can we doubt whether the new is interesting? How can we doubt whether the old is worth saving? And how can we doubt if our selection function, our culture, is currently up to the task? Now, bringing this all back to Haiti, I found it super interesting, especially going through some of these cases, how they are deeply social. It's not so much, and maybe you notice that try to steer, do the almost impossible task to not specifically talk about AI. They are inherently social, and I think if we talk about futures and the realities, we can realize that reality basically is community. And the community and the people that we work with, they make the world that we envision, the world that we remember in the case of Haiti, the world that we forget. So treating our kind of collective capacity to think the unthinkable, to move towards an unthinkable future, it's a community function. And there are 2 things, so all of this is a quote, 2 things that I love. The first one is, if we want to move ahead, act always so as to increase the number of choices. This is something that Heinz von Förster called the ethical imperative. So that means if you don't know where the future is, open up the option space, make things possible, build the infrastructure for the future to emerge, for the parasites to sit in your frames, feed them, see where it goes. Who's invading whose space here? And the third one is, if you desire to see, learn how to act. This isn't a theory exercise. The only way for us to move forward is literally in the thick of it. Staying with the trouble? No, it's hard. But seeing is acting in that sense. Okay, I'm over time. Thank you so much.